The Red Heifer. The Red Heifer. We always talk about the Red Heifer. On Parshat Hukat, we always talk about the Red Heifer, the great mystery of the Red Heifer. Amelie just taught us about this. It purifies you, the ashes of the Red Heifer purifies you from contact with the dead, and it's an intricate ritual. There's cedar wood and hyssop. Hyssop, what is hyssop? And it is all announced, the headline is Zot Chukat Torah. This is the Chukah, the decree of the Torah. This is the Chukah. What is the Chukah? Well, it as Amelie told us, it is a ritual law, translated as ritual law here in our Chumash. It's one of the Israelites have lots of words for law. It's one of our words for law, but it's an important one. It is famously one of the most important pieces of legal theory in the Talmud, distinguishes between two kinds of law, one of which is Mishpatim, the Mishpat, which is the kind of law that even if it hadn't been written, dinhu sheyichtavu, the justice demands that it should have been written. The kinds of laws that we see in the Torah that make sense to us, that are intuitive, that are natural, the kinds of laws that we understand. Laws like the prohibition against murder or theft, some of the basic laws that keep a society together. That's one kind of law that the Torah recognizes, Mishpatim, and the other great category that the Talmud splits off there is Chukim. And Chukim, the Talmud says, are the kinds of laws that you look at and you think, Maseh tohu, this is meaningless. This makes no sense at all. And the Talmud gives some examples, like kosher, like keeping kosher, like not eating a pig. Why don't we eat pigs? Some people think it's for health reasons, but that's not what our tradition says. Our tradition says, as Amelie said, God said so. Right? That's just the way it is. And the Talmud gives other lists of strange laws that we don't understand, like one of my favorites is shatnez. Don't mix wool and linen in one garment. Why? God said so. Okay, and the ultimate chok, the strangest, the most mysterious, the most unknowable law of them all is the law of the Red Heifer. As Rashi puts it, gzeirahi. It's a decree. It's just God said so. There's a great story in the Midrash of King Solomon who says, I succeeded in understanding the whole Torah. Amadati al kol Torah kula. But as soon as I reached this chapter about the Red Heifer, I searched and I probed and I questioned it, and finally I just said, Echkama v'hi rechoka mimeni. I tried to get wisdom, but it was far from me. So that's King Solomon. The wisest man in the world couldn't figure it out, but we keep trying every year. And Amelie just contributed to that canon of attempts to understand the Red Heifer. But I want to just point out another problem, another dilemma embedded in our endless fixation with the mystery of the Red Heifer. And that is that this is not the main story of this parsha. Not by a long shot. I want to suggest that the main story of this parsha is that Moses loses both of his siblings in one chapter. Miriam and Aaron both die in Parshat Hukat. Two of the great leaders of Israel and the two siblings of the greatest leader of Israel die in quick succession. So surely this is the main thing that we should be focused on, that we should be talking about every single year. This is the parsha of the death of Miriam and Aaron. And the red heifer? Who cares about the red heifer? It's just a distraction. Let's move on to chapter 20. But if we think about this for just a second, just take a second and think about it, suddenly realize that this parsha actually has a brilliant structure. Because remember, the red heifer is the ritual that we use when we come into contact with death. And that is exactly what Moses is about to come in contact with. Rashi picks up on this and says, Lama nismecha parshat mitat Miriam le parshat para aduma. Why was the story of Miriam's death juxtaposed with the section of the red heifer? Juxtaposed. Nismecha, these two things are connected. There's a saying in the Talmud that God hikdim trufa lemakah. God creates the healing before God creates the blow. And that is the way chapter 19 and 20 feel to us once we start to realize that the ritual that we use to deal with contact with the dead immediately precedes the two great deaths that Moses will experience along this journey. God creates the healing before God creates the blow. And what an overwhelming blow this must have been for Moses. He lived much of his life estranged from his family, running from danger, but they were there when he needed them most. Right? When he was just a baby, floating down the Nile in a basket, it was his sister who watched after him to make sure he was safe. And when he was called upon to lead the revolution, he only agreed to do it if Aaron would be with him. These two have not just been his family, but his partners and at times his only allies in this long and difficult journey. And now, in an instant, they're both gone. And what will he do? How will he cope? How do any of us cope with death? And what do we do in the face of this inevitable but unbearable reality that the people in our lives are taken away from us? The Talmud in Moed Katan, the Talmud that first points out that the red heifer comes just before Miriam's death, the Talmud goes on then to discuss two kinds of death. Mita chatufa, an immediate death, a death by snatching, and mita dechufa, a delayed death, a death that you know about that is coming. And of course, Miriam's death was instant, was a death by snatching. She was suddenly taken. And Aaron's death had been foretold. So Moses experienced both of these kinds of loss. But death leaves us unprepared, whether we're prepared for it or not. Anyone who's lost someone dear to them knows that. For me, it's the death of my father, which we had some time to prepare for, a few months before the cancer ravaged through his body. But it still took us by surprise. It's over 20 years later, and I still can't wrap my mind around it. I can't comprehend how it is that he was here, and now he's gone. That's my personal loss. But when you're a rabbi in community, you see this all the time. And you come to realize that death is with us every day, every week. Of a large enough group of people, we are always processing this. And, when you're the rabbi in a community, people look to you for answers. But there's really nothing to say. And there's really no explanation. I searched for wisdom, but it was far from me. It was far from me. We don't have answers, but what we do have is ritual. In this tradition, we turn to ritual. At the time when we have no idea what else to do, we go through the motions of our mourning rites and rituals. In a way, just to be doing something, just to be acknowledging the pain of our loss without having to use words, because there are no words to use. There are no real answers. And maybe that's the secret of the red heifer, that there are no answers. There is no explanation. It's just a decree. It's just a mystery. Because death itself is a mystery. And we'll never know why the most natural, unavoidable truth of human life, that one day it ends, feels again and again like the most unfair punishment of all. How could a God that's done such good for us, that's given us so much, our lives, our Torah, the glorious world around us, then suddenly turn around and rip away from us the ones that we love the most. Zot Hukat Torah. This is the decree of the Torah. This is the way of the world. Death is the great mystery. And that's about all the answer that the tradition ever gives us. Again and again we see this frustration in the search for the answer to the mystery of death. Moses famously goes up to the heavens and sees into the future and sees the greatest scholar of the Talmud, Rabbi Akiva, teaching this brilliant Torah. And then fast forwards to see Rabbi Akiva's death, tortured at the hands of the Romans. And Moses turns to God and says, Zot Torah v'zot schara, this is what you get for studying Torah? This is what happens to us? And God just says, shtok, quiet. Kachala b'machshava lefanai. That's just the way it is. That's just the way it is. Job, the most famous of the sufferers, who lost his entire family, turns to God and asks God, why? Why have you afflicted me? And God says, were you there when I laid the earth's foundations? Do you know? Do you know how things work? And that's it. And some things we'll never understand. Maybe we can never understand. But this is not a tradition that pretends to have the answers to the questions of why death and what happens after death. The Torah doesn't offer us answers, but she offers us rituals, chukim, rituals that give us some way to respond when we have no response, that give us something to hold on to when we feel unmoored and adrift in tragedy. And there's one more thing that the Torah offers us. Zot Chukat HaTorah. This is the decree of the Torah, and we are the people of the Torah, of this covenant. The Torah brings us together around these rituals. The end of chapter 20 is V'yivku et Aaron shloshim yom kol Beit Yisrael. And all the house of Israel cried over Aaron for 30 days. And the Midrash tells us that they saw Moses sitting there weeping. And they gathered, and they joined, and they surrounded him, and they cried with him. And that's the other thing that these rituals give us, is a way to come together and to cry together as we together face the great and sometimes terrifying mysteries of life and death. Shabbat Shalom.